It's easy to see Bach as a curmudgeon. He can seem severe, demanding, a workaholic, impatient with imperfection. The composer whose music is all about following rules. Bach was grousing about the singers in his choruses, the instrumentalists in his ensembles. He groused about not getting paid enough. But Bach's music tells a different story. It's filled with moments of tenderness, laughter, humor, enjoyment. This is from Bach's Partita in B-flat major, played by the pianist Susan Starr. When I hear this music, I think, how could someone who hadn't experienced utter joy write music like this? There are other moments too, and other warm and fuzzy emotions. Listen to the love in this aria from the St. Matthew Passion, in which one of Jesus' disciples sings of her devotion to him. She's singing, "I'll give my heart to you. Sink thyself in it, my salvation. I will submerge myself in you. And if the world is too small for you, then for me alone shall you be more than world and heaven." Where did the joy, tenderness, humor, and love in that music come from? Bach didn't leave us much to go on in the way of answers. We know that he had a huge family, and that for sure was one source of happiness. Bach's first wife, Maria Barbara, bore him 7 children, and his second wife, Anna Magdalena, bore him 13. Many of these children died, but Bach was intensely connected to the survivors. He taught them to sing and to play instruments, and along with Anna Magdalena, who was also a singer, organized them into many vocal and instrumental ensembles. According to one of Bach's sons, the house was like a beehive. Musical visitors arriving to perform in town always stopped by the Bach home. Kids were everywhere. Music students came and went for lessons. Variation 20, which we heard last time with Rachel Breen, would have been a great soundtrack for the Bach beehive. Nor was Bach friendless. He was well liked by many who knew him, including some members of the gentry who employed him in their courts. I like one poem that a friend wrote Bach on his 50th birthday. It's a little over the top, but hey, you only turned 50 once. The friend wrote, quote, "O day come often, joyous day return, when God gave you to us and Bach was born. We thank him, praying that he long your life may spare, for seldom does the world receive a gift so rare." My interviewee for today is Kevin's son, a young pianist who is both a medical student at Stanford University and a doctoral student at Eastman School of Music. I met Kevin when we were in college. We both spent a lot of time in the music building. Often, in my senior year, I'd walk down the hall of the music building late at night and hear Kevin practicing the Goldberg Variations. He didn't know it, but I'd stop and put my ear to the door and listen for a few moments. It was Kevin's dad who introduced him to music early on.
My dad didn't grow up a musician. His father liked opera and piano and such, but in communist China, that was very difficult to get your hands on. So he didn't really grow up around that stuff. So here in the United States, he has access to a library now, and look at all these jewels. He would go to the library, always the library, and pick out the CDs, listen to them himself, and then without really setting it up much, just play them for me, see how I'd respond.
Kevin developed into an extraordinary pianist, and he offers a version of the Goldberg Variations that is very much in touch with the softer side of Bach.
He wrote on the title page that it's for the enjoyment and the refreshment of the minds of music connoisseurs. And that refreshment and enjoyment is so key.
The softer side of Bach was on full display when Kevin started talking about Variations 22, 23, and 24. We last left off in darkness with Variation 21. Here's Rachel Breen again. With Variation 22, we enter a new chapter. This is Kevin now.
Variation 22 seems at first to be a very simple, high-spirited, almost kind of like a drinking song, buoyant piece. But then you start to see things. The best evidence for the joy of this variation is an extremely long trill that he carries through 2 1/4 measures, and up until here, it's the longest trill of any trill in the variations.
This is the trill, which makes the music sound like it's shimmering. The trill acts as a kind of signal or foreshadow for what's to come.
We'll see that later, this idea of a long trill, this kind of horn-like sound, signals this utter joy that, aside from Variation 25, is what we can characterize the end of the Goldberg Variations as.
That idea of a trill appears elsewhere in the final variations. Here it is in Variation 24. And then we get a more bombastic version in Variation 29. From the darkness of Variation 21, Variation 22 starts to glow. By the end of the piece, the music will ignite and send off fireworks.
The piece as a whole needs to make sense. So we have to interpret each variation as coming out of another variation. 22 makes sense fast because 21 was so sad. We need release. We need joy.
22 gives us that first sense of light at the end of the tunnel. Variation 23.
It's interesting that Variation 23 is not a canon considering how it starts. Basically, you have the 2 hands chasing each other, playing exactly the same notes, just offset by half a beat in the very beginning.
Like a canon, one voice enters and then another follows, playing the same thing, in this case an octave higher. It can be a little bit difficult to hear, but notice how in the beginning all of the notes are traveling in the same direction.
He tricks us. It's almost like the variation in octaves or variation in unison has come one too early.
What Kevin's referring to is that every third variation in the piece is a canon. In this set, we're expecting another canon, but not until the next variation. So Bach is being playful, musically speaking, by giving us something that starts off sounding like a canon here in 23. That's Bach's first joke. It's not actually very funny. It's like an inside joke for music nerds. But Bach starts to be more obvious about his goofing around as the variation goes on.
But he starts to hint at something more playful. These runs, and these runs continue later until they explode into this kind of character that's just so full of life in
both hands, the left hand adamantly ornamented, every single beat ornamented, and the right hand just either playing intervals together or playing these runs, these short fragmented things.
Putting the hands together, it sounds like this.
It's just so full of bright energy that we would not have expected from the very beginning of this variation.
So maybe Bach had a sense of humor, even if it's a little difficult to get the joke 280 years later. One biographer described Bach's humor as more vigorous than subtle, and somewhat on the coarse side. Music offered another forum for joking. When testing an organ, Bach apparently would scare the wits out of its makers by declaring that he needed to know whether the organ had good lungs. He'd then pull out every stop and play the fullest music he could, shaking the rafters. The organ makers would go pale with fright. On other occasions, Bach would pick up his viola and spontaneously join musicians while they were playing a trio. He'd start by following along. Then, if he sensed that the composer wouldn't be hurt, he would riff another part on the fly, converting the trio into a quartet. This was Bach at play in the music. In Variation 23, he's at play too.
Really, how I would describe this variation is full of effects. Pretty witty and gay. That's how I would describe this variation.
Okay, so humor in music is rarely side-splitting. It's not like you listen and then crack up. The playfulness is often packaged as a surprise, but one that's invisible unless you follow the music closely. Which brings us finally to another source of joy for Bach, the music itself. Carl Philipp Emanuel, one of Bach's sons, once described in a letter how, when he was young, he would stand next to his dad as they listened to music. When the musician started to play a complex fugue, Bach would turn to his son and whisper how he thought the fugue would develop. Then, as Bach's guesses proved correct, he would gleefully nudge his son to say, "I told you so." I love this image of father and son, standing next to each other and chuckling at turns in the music. When I was wondering where Bach might have derived joy or comfort or humor, the answer was there all the time. Bach didn't just translate good memories into music. The music could be its own source of happiness for him. This is Variation 24. It's the canon at the octave, meaning that one voice repeats what the other has just done, but in this case, an octave lower. The interval of an octave is different than all other intervals in that the notes on both sides of the octave are the same. On the keyboard, if you play the note of C, for example, and then walk down 7 notes, you get to another C. That's the octave.
There's something so precious about a canon in octaves, where the theme is so valued that it gets to be played twice with the same notes, but in a different voice. It's like two people really sharing this very same idea, and this idea of sharing between voices creates a kind of intimacy to this variation that is happy at its core, but also is so full of warmth. And it just creates this spiritual comfort that we need before we turn to Variation 25. And I strongly believe that Variation 25, the infamous Black Pearl, the infamous emotional climax of the whole Variations, would not work, would not have its weight and its rawness if not for variation 24 setting it up. We need the love that's in 24 before the tragedy that's in 25.
This variation is in 9/8 time, meaning that in each measure we have 9 beats. No other variation is counted the same way.
9/8 is unique and the audience hears it. Within each third of the measure, within each of those triple meter beats, Bach can create another universe, nestle within one beat of the triple meter, another triple meter. And he does that very well because he ends up using a rhythmic motif that I can play right now. Where he suspends us for a third of that one beat and then lets us go. Suspends, lets us go.
It's kind of like the music is cradling us, swinging us back and forth in its arms.
Somehow Bach is really good at satisfying our psychological needs as humans. I think there's a reason why he's the musician with the most recordings on this golden disc that we've sent out into space. I think he's represented on there 5 times. And, Stravinsky once, Bob Dylan once maybe, but Bach 5 times. Somehow Bach, through regularity, finds diversity, and then through diversity satisfies these psychological nuances, is able to find the different shades of joy, happiness, which is different from joy, pleasure, which is different from happiness, which is different from joy. All these qualities of a similar psychological thing, and just point out different shades of it through harmony and figuration.
Variation 24 ends with what Kevin calls the bells.
There are these bells that ring at the very end of the variation. First we have it in the bass. But you don't really hear it because there's too much happening in the other voices. But then it really erupts in the very next measure. And then
according to Kevin, these bells first appear in Variation 12.
it really is a kind of hearkening back to that other time. And I think even foreshadowing the things that will come in Variation 25. You have these church bells in 24, and then 25 is really where the tragedy is going to start. It is this kind of precious two-sided memory that one carries through this life journey that is the Goldberg Variations.
Bach once addressed a poem to Prince Leopold's newborn son. He wrote, quote, "The wise men of our time affright us oft by saying we come into this world with cries and wails of woe, as if so soon we knew the bitterness of staying even this short time in weary travail here below. But this do I turn round about, instead proclaiming that thy sweet, childish cries are lovely, clear, and pure. Thus shall thy whole life be with gladness teeming, a harmony, complete of joys and pleasures sure." So often in Bach's music, you get this duality. The fear, the darkness, the misery of life on earth, contrasted with warmth, joy, light. In Variations 22, 23, and 24, we've gotten a dose of optimism and tenderness. Here's Kevin's son playing those variations. Thanks for listening. In this episode, you heard music performed by Kevin's son, as well as by the pianist Susan Starr. You also heard a part of the St. Matthew Passion, performed by the Netherlands Bach Society. And Bach organ music performed by James Kibbe. It's worth pausing to thank the Netherlands Bach Society and James Kibbe in particular for allowing me to use their music throughout this podcast. It would not be the same without them. Thanks also to my editor, David Schreiberg. In the next episode, we arrive at the dark center of the piece. It's here that I hope you'll see just how meaningful Bach's music can be for people. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.